Okay, welcome everyone to the Southeast Utility Policy Highlights for July through September of 2022. Please note this webinar is being recorded. If you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A box, and our panelists will respond after the presentation. Following this webinar, we'll send out the recording, slide deck, and resources mentioned in the presentation to all the registrants. You will receive a follow-up survey to provide feedback on our webinar. At this point, I'll turn things over to Cyrus Bhedwar, Director of Policy. Take it away, Cyrus.
Thank you, Lily. Good afternoon and welcome to the Southeast Utility Policy Highlights webinar. We really appreciate you joining us today. As Lily said, my name is Cyrus Bhedwar and I serve as SEIA's Director of Energy Efficiency Policy. I'm joined today by my colleague, and Kate Lee. As SEIA members, we hope you're familiar with us and the work we do. But as a reminder, sorry about that.
Just 1 second.
We hope you're familiar with us and the work we do, but as a reminder, SEIA promotes efficient energy as a catalyst for economic growth, workforce development, and energy security across 11 southeastern states. We provide a wide range of services, including research, consultation and education, stakeholder facilitation, program management, and financial services to a diverse set of stakeholders in the energy sector. The policy team is also putting finishing touches on the last 3 of our state guides to utility energy efficiency. These reports describe the regulatory system that governs energy efficiency in each state that SEIA serves. They're designed to help stakeholders better understand and, if desired, engage in the regulatory processes throughout the Southeast. Visit SEIAalliance.org/state utility guides to find all of them. And since today is the runoff election for one of Georgia's U.S. Senate seats, it's certainly relevant to mention that SEIA has released its 2022 election highlights, covering the elections of interest for the region. We'll certainly update with today's results, but you can find the current list at SEIAalliance.org/blog. And I'd like to recognize SEIA's program associate, Lily Smith, for her work on both the state utility guides and the election highlights. Today's webinar reflects a shift in how SEIA is delivering regional intelligence to our members. For several years, SEIA produced quarterly policy highlights, which are archived in the Resource Center on our website. Based on your feedback, we've moved the highlights to this webinar format. You'll have the chance to tell us what you think via a brief survey at the end of the presentation. Today, we'll cover state, regional, and local policy developments that directly and indirectly impact energy efficiency and related issues. Following that, we'll also do a deep dive on one of the significant energy policy developments that's occurred in the last few years, the South Carolina Energy Freedom Act. But now, I'm pleased to introduce Claudette Ayanaba, SEIA's policy manager, who has worked with several of our stakeholders to put this next section of our presentation together. As a member of the policy team, Claudette works on finding ways to provide research, technical assistance, and engagement to help stakeholders make smart and informed energy-related decisions.
Hi, and welcome everyone. My name is Claudette Ayanaba. I am the policy manager at SEIA. My report today will include regional developments that are trending, then cyclical regulatory actions, then anomalies or events that are unusual for our state or unusual for the region. I will conclude with an update on the region and one national update. But before I begin, as Cyrus said, I would like to acknowledge and thank all the stakeholders and all who contributed and took time to provide state updates so that we could deliver this webinar. If you have any questions during my presentation, please submit them via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and we'll respond at the end of the webinar. 9 out of 10 costliest natural disasters in the United States are hurricanes. Energy efficiency improvements to buildings, energy systems, and communities improve resiliency to natural disasters. Coastal areas in Louisiana and Florida are trying to mitigate the cost of those powerful storms. As extreme weather events increase, utilities and regulatory bodies are trying to grapple with how to recover from storm damage. During the 2020-2021 hurricane season, the state of Louisiana accumulated $4.4 billion worth of storm damages. In response, New Orleans City Council has required Entergy New Orleans to develop strategic plans instead of reactive measures, which can support a more resilient grid. To improve resiliency and storm hardening on Entergy's system, the council opened docket UD 2103. On July 1st, Entergy New Orleans submitted its resilient and storm hardening filing. This docket will assist in improving the energy system and support a safer, more climate-ready New Orleans. New Orleans is the only city in the Southeast where an investor-owned utility is regulated by the City Council. Every year, Florida utilities submit 10-year site plans or long-term plans, which are Florida-style integrated resource plans. In 2019, before Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Michael, 10-year site plans typically charted the amount of generation needed to supply electricity for the next 10 years and how this would be reflected in customer rates. After these major natural disasters, the law was changed to also require storm protection plans that account for the cost of restoring power after major storms. As we come off of one of the busiest hurricane seasons, you will see a common question being posed to utilities. Who is going to pay for all these damages incurred? The 10-year plans and storm protection plans attempt to create a more resilient energy system. If you made it to our last policy highlights webinar, you heard that during a public hearing, Florida Power and Light presented a scenario based off a 1989 winter storm and quickly withdrew that option. Since the hearing, the Florida Public Service Commission approved, with some changes, plans submitted by the major investor-owned utilities. Plans included new natural gas plants and new underground power lines. Utilities had until October 25th to file revised plans. In a report by Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory on modeling energy efficiency as a resource in a typical utility in the South, researchers asked several questions of a fictional Southeast utility, modeling scenarios such as business as usual, aggressive energy efficiency case, only technical potential options, energy efficiency bundled measures, and other assumptions. Is your organization or entity tasked with developing these types of models, and what questions are you asking? Is your utility's service area summer peaking or winter peaking? Are you including all EE measures or just demand response programs? In the next IRP cycle in 2025, Georgia Power will need to decide which assumptions are going to be included in their forecast model. This year, the Public Service Commission required that Georgia Power model EE measures alongside supply side measures in their next IRP. The South Carolina Energy Freedom Act of 2019 requires both Duke Energy and Dominion Energy to model EE as a resource. It is Dominion's turn in this upcoming 2023 IRP submittal to do so. The filing must be submitted by January 2023. Georgia Power, the Georgia Public Service Commission, and stakeholders have been intensely deliberating the 2022 rate case. Decisions will be made concerning rooftop solar, rate structures, and a Georgia Power proposal to raise rates by 12% over the next 3 years. Coal ash pond cleanup, grid improvements, cleaner resources, and an increase in demand side management spending are all included in those calculations. Advocates are requesting that with such a steep rate hike, these costs need to be revisited on an annual basis rather than every 3 years. Dates of the public hearings and the deadline for the commission to make a decision are listed on here on slide 9. As a side note, the term public hearing is used here, but very much resembles a court case. I can't believe that I have sat through 2 out of 3 rounds of IRPs as they happen every 3 years. IRP hearings are similar to rate hearings as witnesses such as PSC staff and Georgia Power experts are cross-examined by advocates and Georgia Power attorneys. Very often, one or more commissioners will ask follow-up questions. Most states record regulatory hearings and post them online. You can find the Georgia PSC hearings recordings online at the Georgia Public Service Commission YouTube channel. Most of the content is very niche, but there are the occasional volume of enlightening discussions. To learn more about regulatory proceedings in the Southeast, as was said before, check out our state guides to utility energy efficiency planning at sealliance.org/state utility guides. In Mississippi, both Mississippi Power and Entergy Mississippi have increased demand-side management funding and a number of programs. For commercial and industrial customers, Mississippi Power added a program and has plans to expand a program. They are also expanding a residential low-income measure to include multifamily and adding a new home program where new homes are built with certain energy efficiency standards. Not just Mississippi Power, but also Entergy has launched 3 new DSM programs: the Residential Thermostat Demand Response, Residential New Construction, and Agricultural Equipment. In July, Mississippi Public Service Commission approved Entergy's request for a budget increase. The adjustment includes $13.1 million for COVID bad debt deferral, recent major storm recovery expenses, an increase in demand-side management programs budget, and spending for grid modernization. There's also a cost adjustment factor in an attempt to provide bill stability for all customers. Mississippi Power's rate increase was approved in June. Annually, by commission order, all electric and natural gas utilities are required to file a summary of program types, customers served, energy savings, and costs. Annual delivery plans are not just submitted by investor-owned utilities, but also co-ops and municipalities. Brent Bailey, Commissioner of the Central District, publishes a very informative newsletter. In the September edition, he included a table listing the high points of the annual delivery plans and links to the utilities' annual reports. We have provided a link to his newsletter in the chat. In addition to Dominion's 2023 IRP requirements, 2 stakeholder groups were formed as IRP advisory groups. The Dominion Energy Efficiency Advisory Group, which is focused primarily on developing DSM potential study that will be used to analyze energy efficiency and demand response resources. The other is the IRP Stakeholder Advisory Group, which is focused on solely technical potential measures. Whereas the EE Advisory Group looks at the programmatic side, the IRP Stakeholder Group examines the technical aspects of DSM. One last key EE requirement is the levels of EE that must be modeled. They must conduct an analysis of energy efficiency starting at 1% and ramping up to 2% of annual sales. As I mentioned before, this must all be decided upon by the commission by January 30th. In a few minutes, I will turn it over to Cyrus and our guest speakers, Kate Lee Mixon and Dawn Hipp, for more about the Energy Freedom Act. Last quarter, NextEra Energy, parent of Florida Power and Light and Gulf Power, set a carbon emissions goal of net zero by 2045. NextEra is calling it the most ambitious carbon emissions reduction goal ever set by an energy producer. The latest utility to pledge decarbonization goals is TVA. A request for proposal was opened in July, requesting 5,000 megawatts of carbon-free energy that must be operational before 2029. In other decarbonization news, we have House Bill 951 updates. To recap, in efforts to achieve carbon neutrality by the year 2050, the North Carolina legislature passed House Bill 951 in October 2021, directing the State Utility Commission to take reasonable steps to reduce carbon emissions from Duke Energy. This goal is set to be achieved through performance-based rate making, net metering, and a carbon plan. In response, Duke submitted their carbon plan on May 16th with 4 portfolio scenarios. Duke's plan proposes growing energy efficiency and demand-side customer programs to reduce demand by more than 3,400 megawatts by 2030. When considering how Duke proposes to meet the energy efficiency target, it is important to understand that 1% of the eligible load excludes industrials and large commercial opt-out customers that will not be included in the savings target. However, advocates propose that Duke can achieve 1.5% of energy efficiency savings of total annual sales. During expert witness testimony, the commission asked Duke to consider the 1.5% of sales and to identify additional savings opportunities. Following the request, Duke submitted several scenarios in which the utility could achieve 1.5% energy savings. As it stands, the commission is set to make a decision by December 31st. Virginia is unique in that it is the only regional greenhouse gas initiative, or RGGI state, that dedicates 50% of its carbon trading funding to make both new and existing low-income housing more energy efficient. To recap, in 2020, Virginia became the first Southeast state to join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This is a regional cap and trade program designed to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from the energy sector. Regulated power plants are given allowances for CO2 emissions, which are then auctioned each quarter. The proceeds of the quarterly auctions are used by the state to fund energy efficient, affordable housing, coastal resilience, and community flood preparedness. In Virginia's first year of participation, RGGI provided $114 million in funding for energy efficiency programs, which is more than any other energy efficiency program in the state. By comparison, the amount utilities spend on low-income energy efficiency programs is much lower. Even state allotments planned for the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act pale in comparison to RGGI funds. This is not to say that utility program funding and federal funding are not essential. All funds going towards those struggling with energy bills and living in unhealthy housing are very much needed. But RGGI funds are exponentially higher in magnitude and impact. On August 31st, 2022, the Youngkin administration announced its intent to withdraw from RGGI via regulatory action to the Air Pollution Control Board. Governor Youngkin opened a 30-day comment period to withdraw from RGGI. Advocates say that Virginia entered RGGI through legislation and therefore would require legislation to withdraw. The current contract must be honored through 2023. If Virginia withdraws from RGGI, funding going towards programs such as the Weatherization Deferral Program will significantly decrease. In regional developments, the Southeast Energy Exchange Market, or SEAM, has started allowing power producers to buy and sell power. The platform allows for automated and sub-hourly trading very close to the time energy is consumed. Participation is not limited to SEAM members only. According to SEAM, all qualifying power producers can use the platform, and the platform is intended to generate customer savings, quote, through lower fuel costs as we're able to select lower cost and more efficient generation resources to serve customer demand, end quote. Although there is still a lawsuit pending in court, SEAM is moving forward and doing so with several new members. 4 Florida energy companies, Duke Energy Florida, JEA, Seminole Electric Cooperative, and Tampa Electric Company, have signed agreements to join as members of SEAM starting January 1st. Earlier this year, the U.S. Department of Energy finalized a pair of rules that will phase out the manufacture of older incandescent light bulbs to begin the transition over to efficient LEDs and compact fluorescent lighting. The agency estimates families will save about $100 annually, or almost $3 billion collectively. Beginning September 1st, manufacturers of light bulbs were sent notices of upcoming enforcement deadlines. As utilities submit plans for future lighting rebate programs, they are accounting for this in their assessments. That completes my report, and I will now turn it back to Cyrus to begin our in-depth conversation on the South Carolina Energy Freedom Act.
Thank you so much, Claudette, for that in-depth rundown. Really appreciate it. And for our audience, just a reminder that you can ask any questions about the material presented today using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer those at the end of the webinar. It's now my pleasure to introduce our 2 guests who have joined us to help us take a deep dive into the current state of one of the more significant energy policy developments that's taken place over the past several years. As we discussed at the 2022 Southeast Energy Summit, the remarkable events of the past several years have overshadowed many significant energy policy developments throughout the region. Last month, we covered the Virginia Clean Economy Act and related developments, such as Virginia's entry into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This month, we're covering South Carolina's Energy Freedom Act with 2 guests who have lived and breathed this law since its inception. To help us understand what this legislation is and where things stand, I'm joined now by Dawn Hipp and Kate Nixon. Dawn currently serves as the Chief Operating Officer for the Office of Regulatory Staff in South Carolina. Her office was created by Act 175 in 2004 and is charged with representing the public interest of South Carolina in utility regulation for all major utility industries in the state. Kate Nixon, a staff attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center, is focused on South Carolina. Kate works through legislation, policy, and litigation to advance clean energy resources like solar, energy efficiency, and battery storage. She represents clean energy nonprofit clients in proceedings before the state utility regulators and develops and manages relationships with utilities, trade allies, and other organizations working to advance clean energy in the state today. Thank you both for joining us. Dawn, I'll start with you. Can you tell us what is the purpose of the Energy Freedom Act and how does it address or impact issues such as energy efficiency and or electric transportation? 2 issues our audience is quite interested in.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Cyrus. I really appreciate it. The Energy Freedom Act is really designed to accelerate and create additional pathways for deployment of both utility and customer-sited renewable energy, including energy storage. Primarily, as we see the Energy Freedom Act as it relates to your membership, we see that the Energy Freedom Act requires a very stringent review and valuation of the utilities' avoided energy and capacity costs, which directly impacts the valuation of energy efficiency measures deployed by our investor-owned utilities. The Energy Freedom Act emphasized the importance of energy efficiency and demand response as part of the utility planning portfolio. And you heard Claudette mention that as she was running down both Georgia and South Carolina initiatives. It is evident based on the 2020 planning cycle undertaken by the Public Service Commission that the increased focus on planning and oversight given by the Commission has resulted in a more rigorous standard for utilities and a direct impact and value on the energy efficiency and demand response initiatives. Act 62, or the Energy Freedom Act, also required Santee Cooper, our publicly owned utility, to provide an integrated resource plan to the Public Service Commission, and we will see the first one from Santee Cooper here in 2023. The Energy Freedom Act provides opportunities for all customers who ORS represents in part of the public interest test that we are tasked with, to reduce and manage their electric consumption in a manner that will reduce peak demand. And so that directly relates to energy efficiency and electrification as we look ahead. The Energy Freedom Act also equips customers with the information and ability to manage their utility bills. So throughout all of the components of the Energy Freedom Act, including a solar choice and net metering, you'll see the discussions in front of the Public Service Commission have a component of customer ability to manage their utility bills. And finally, from our perspective, while the Act doesn't directly address electrification, it does provide the stepping stones to electrification initiatives filed by the utilities at the Commission in enabling utilities to design rates and programs to incentivize customers to purchase EVs or to look at times to charge their vehicles to shave the peak.
Thank you so much. That's quite a comprehensive package there. Appreciate that. Turning to Kate, as I alluded to, a lot has happened since the passage of the law that is outside the energy sector. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective, what has happened since the passage of this law? And in particular, has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the implementation of the law from your perspective?
Great, thanks, Cyrus. And I wanted to check, are you all able to hear me okay now?
We are. You're coming
Okay, great. And apologies for not being on video anymore.
We just did lose you.
It was breaking up for me a little bit, but you can't hear me anymore?
You are going in and out a little bit, but continue.
How about this? I will sign off and call back in. I think that may be better. Is that okay?
Sounds good. We'll just continue with talking for a moment.
I'll be back in 1 minute.
No worries. So Dawn, we spent a lot of time thinking about how energy efficiency is embedded in larger policies and issues in the region. And two that we've kind of noted of importance are decarbonization, obviously. We heard a lot in Claudette's report about various decarbonization initiatives that utilities and regulators are considering or implementing right now. And then, of course, equity. Equity has been an issue that's emerging in my mind since the days of the Clean Power Plan, when EPA added significant community and stakeholder engagement provisions to that law. So I'm curious, from your perspective, how does the Energy Freedom Act address or impact each of those issues?
From our perspective, which is unique, as a state agency tasked to represent the public interest, meaning all classes of customers, and continued investment in high quality and reliable utility service, we do not advocate or lobby for certain pieces of legislation. The Energy Freedom Act, while it does not state the words decarbonization and equity directly, it certainly lays the foundation for any subsequent legislation, or allows the Commission to also take a look at those items when it's making its decisions. Particularly, it places an emphasis on the avoided cost methodology, which has different societal type benefit cost attribution categories. It also translates into a more favorable environment for adding emerging technologies. So when the avoided cost is set correctly, then you see an uptick or acceleration in deployment of emerging technologies such as storage, removing some of the barriers that cause folks to look at renewable energy as a premium product versus a standard type product, and it makes systems more economical for customers. The other part of it is it promoted outside of the box thinking. While it focused on renewable energy, it did not preclude the commission and developers or utilities from thinking outside of the box to provide a more diverse portfolio. And I think that's really it. It also, in terms of equity, there is one specific call out in the Energy Freedom Act that talks about community and neighborhood solar programs, with the intention of looking at programs for hard to reach individuals, multi-unit dwelling, low to moderate income individuals who might not have access to solar panels. The barrier to that is some language that's inserted in the Energy Freedom Act, which does not allow for costs to be shifted to the general body of ratepayers. And so that is something that it has been difficult to implement due to that obstacle.
Thank you. That's great. That's great to hear. Looks like we have Kate back. Welcome back to you. So Kate, we were curious to hear your perspective about the, sitting where you sit, about the implementation of the law since its inception, with a particular, any commentary you care to share about the impact of the pandemic, which I imagine changed the way stakeholders had to approach the implementation of this law.
Yes, so hopefully everybody can hear me now. I had to change locations. But I guess to start, in terms of what's happened since the EFA's implementation, I think it's actually kind of difficult to explain concisely. The extent to which the EFA kind of broadened the scope and the number of proceedings that come before the commission means that there has been a whole lot of new dockets that have opened, and some of those include really big comprehensive dockets like utility IRPs. So I think I could take kind of all day or multiple days to explain kind of all of the developments since its passage, but I think Claudette did a nice job earlier of discussing a couple of the kind of energy efficiency focused highlights, which happened in the 2020 IRP proceedings. Just to add a little bit more color to that, so the EFA requires utilities to file IRPs every 3 years with updates in between. And it kind of establishes two sets of requirements. First, for what the utilities have to include in their IRPs, and then second, kind of set of standards that the commission has to consider in deciding whether to approve a utility IRP. And at the heart of the IRP requirements of the statute is a requirement that utilities fairly evaluate both demand and supply side options in their IRPs, including low, medium, and high cases for the adoption of renewable energy and energy efficiency and demand response, and also incorporating different sensitivity analyses within that for things like fuel costs, environmental regulations, and kind of broader language, other uncertainties or risks. And on the commission side, it says a commission may only approve a utilities IRP if it determines it is the most reasonable and prudent plan, taking into account things like reliability, diversity of generation, and consumer affordability and least cost. And so all of those factors, played a role in the commission's determination in the 2020 IRPs that the utilities failed to fairly evaluate energy efficiency and demand side management resources in different ways for Duke and for Dominion, but then to require that the utilities either file modified IRPs in 2020 to change how they evaluated EE, or setting requirements for how they evaluate energy efficiency in future IRPs, including for Dominion using a different type of modeling software that should be able to model DSM as a resource in their 2023 IRP. Since the EFA sets a recurring schedule for those IRP proceedings, at this point, like the planning dockets, like they're going to be iterative in nature. I think the 2020 proceedings took quite a bit longer than anticipated. And so the timing going into 23 has been kind of interesting, just waiting for final commission decisions on some of these update proceedings. But right now we're just kind of getting past this first iteration of these new IRP requirements, and then we'll be moving into the next one. In terms of how COVID has impacted implementation, the EFA was passed the summer before the pandemic started, and so many of the first of all of these new commission proceedings happened either at the end of 2019 or throughout 2020 and 2021. And so the most apparent way that COVID has kind of affected its implementation is that a lot of those major proceedings had to take place entirely virtually at the commission. And that definitely created a few headaches from a logistical standpoint, especially at first. But I mean, in my opinion, I think the commission has done like a really great job of working through those technology issues and putting systems in place to make things run smoothly for some of these proceedings, which lasted a week, 2 weeks, with things like just presenting exhibits and all of that. I think the jumps in technology and how we were able to handle these virtual proceedings was really fantastic. And COVID, certainly had a really significant impact on utility, energy efficiency program implementation, particularly direct install programs, and some of the community-based programs that where the utility would go into a neighborhood or community for kind of educational or outreach efforts. Obviously, all of those had to go on pause during the pandemic, and once everything started opening back up, the higher demand for coal and gas has also been one of several really significant domestic and international factors that have resulted in higher fuel costs for utilities, meaning higher costs for them to run their coal and gas plants, and also more volatility in those fuel markets. And so those higher fuel costs have resulted in pretty significant rate increases for IOU customers over the past year, which, in our view, just kind of underscores the importance of expanding utility energy efficiency efforts moving forward.
Thank you, Kate. That was great. Great description of what's happened over the past few years. In a moment, I'd like to kind of turn to each of you to kind of forecast what's to come next. Dawn, we were talking a little bit about that before we started the webinar. But I wanted to just pause and invite you each to just offer any observations that we haven't touched on from the experience you've had over the implementation of this law. Has anything been notable to you? Anything jumped out? Anything unexpected that you experienced as y'all march forward through implementation? Dawn, I'll turn to you first.
Sure. I think, this is related to the Energy Freedom Act. I think what we saw, it is a second iteration of a large energy reform bill. So we had Act 236 back in 2014. We followed that by the Energy Freedom Act, which really touches on a lot of the aspects, making the process more transparent and accessible for parties. Before, it was really kind of a one-way street in South Carolina. The utility would file something, you go to the Public Service Commission, there would or wouldn't be an opportunity to be heard or to use the discovery tools available. And so the Energy Freedom Act really made these issues accessible. It also heightened the awareness of the value of stakeholder groups. Working and engaging your stakeholders from a utilities perspective has become commonplace. We started under the Energy Freedom Act with several of our utilities using stakeholder groups, and Claudette touched on them a little bit earlier, to form their energy efficiency programs and really kind of flesh that out and test run some ideas. You roll forward to the IRP, and the utilities are using stakeholder groups to really share some of this in-depth technical information, kind of vet some things. Some of them make it into the filed IRP, some of them don't, but folks have had an opportunity to weigh in on that. Coming out of the Energy Freedom Act, I think it has laid a nice foundation for folks to work together on things such as electrification. So our General Assembly passed another piece of legislation in 2021 that requires our commission to open a docket to look at different aspects related to electrification. And our commission will do that sometime after April 1st of 2023. And they'll be looking at the grid impacts of electrification, setting some sort of, rate schedule. There's lots of different things they'll look at there for electrification. Folks now have a reasonable expectation in South Carolina that they are involved in the process. And that is because the Energy Freedom Act opened the door to that.
Well, thank you. That's great to hear. Kate, your thoughts?
I don't really have that much more to add to what Dawn said. I was going to touch on a lot of the commission's focus on transparency and stakeholder engagement coming out of the IRPs. And again, it's kind of filtered into a number of other different proceedings as well, like not just the IRPs, but energy efficiency, the energy efficiency collaboratives. And I think that is a really positive outcome of the statute, as well as just giving interested parties a foot in the door and an opportunity to be heard before the commission and to present their case. And just again, kind of having a set of standards in place to hold the utilities to, and to give the commission guidance about what they should and should not approve, I think has just been a real game changer in terms of how just the South Carolina energy space. And so yeah, that's all that I had to add.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. It sounds like that has been one of the major impacts of this law is to bring more people to the table, which is something that we are always encouraged by when we see it. So I'm going to turn to you in a second, but before I do, I'm going to invite our audience again, just remind them they have the opportunity to submit questions via the Q&A. We do have one, and I'm going to pose it directly after you answer my next question before we move into the final stages of the webinar. But I'd love to hear from you if you can share with our audience about what they can expect next with respect to proceedings under the Energy Freedom Act. And if you can share where can folks go to stay aware of what's going on, given this new emphasis on transparency and stakeholder engagement. Dawn, I'll start with you.
Sure, I'll be glad to. A couple things that you can expect next, and Kate alluded to that, is we're headed into the comprehensive review of the utilities 2023 integrated resource plans. And so that is, will kick off in earnest first part of 2023 to include Santee Cooper. You will also see simultaneous to that a discussion ongoing about the utilities avoided cost. It's a 5-year routine where we'll take a look at the avoided cost methodologies and valuations, setting the new round of avoided costs, and that directly relates to what we've been talking about. The other things that you'll see coming out of the Energy Freedom Act, the Commission had started in 2022 a discussion about the integration study that the Commission is permitted to do. They have convened a technical team, and I believe the Commission intends to start meeting on that integration study, and that's integration at the distribution and transmission level of renewables, looking at barriers, that type of thing. They did some scoping work here in 2022, and you'll see some of that result in a cohesive scope of work, potentially to retain a consultant under. You will hear, from our office in particular about affordability concerns for customers as we're talking about integrated resource planning. We're going to be talking about maybe some state jurisdictional issues between North and South Carolina as it relates to Duke Energy. Our office is particularly concerned about the impacts from the Energy Freedom Act on the affordability for customers who either can't avail themselves of some of the renewable energy facilities or energy efficiency programs. And how do we control the cost by and also receive a corresponding benefit for those customers. And then last, I already plugged the commission's work potentially on electric vehicles and supportive structures related to investor-owned utilities and electrification. So I'll stop there. There are probably more. Kate, I hope you can pick up some more. There's more.
Yeah, I'll say, this is maybe one example of some perhaps unintended consequences of the Energy Freedom Act is that just with the timing, with the triennial IRP schedule, along with the biennial consideration of utility avoided costs, in addition to the passage of Act 90, which puts Santee Cooper before the commission for its IRP as well. All of those were happening in 2023 at one time, which means that all of us, South Carolina energy attorneys are going to be very, very busy in 2023. I'll just, add in addition to what, Dawn, or I guess the proceedings that Dawn went through, there will also be dockets where the utilities are, or where the commission is considering utility programs to competitively procure renewable energy. Those will also be taking place kind of in the first part of 2023. And I'll say, from our perspective, 2023 is really going to be a big year, a really important year, particularly as, kind of all of our state utilities are, considering whether when to retire their aging coal plants, and what resources should be deployed in their wake. I think a lot of the decisions around what South Carolina's energy future will look like are going to kind of have their foundation set based on the commission's decisions in 2023.
Well, thank you both for that. I really appreciate that. It does spur one other question I hadn't thought of to ask earlier, but are you aware of the commission beginning to take into account any of the federal legislation and investment that we're anticipating? There's a lot on the grid side, there's a lot on the supply side, from a clean energy perspective. Has the South Carolina Commission expressed any interest or made any moves to begin thinking about how those resources may factor in or influence or change the way they make decisions about some of these issues? Kate, maybe I'll start with you this time.
Yeah. So at this point, I think the commission has largely just been trying to collect information from different parties about both the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. They, I know, opened an informational proceeding and gathered comments from utilities and kind of ORS, our clients, on what they should consider in, or I guess how they should consider these different funding streams under the Infrastructure Act in their decisions. But I think that, especially as it relates to the Inflation Reduction Act and all of the new funding streams around, clean energy and energy efficiency, that's going to definitely play a big role in kind of the whole host of proceedings that are going to come before the commission that kind of factors into, what assumptions that the utilities use for the cost of these different resources. What funding streams are available for utility programs, or how they may be able to leverage those funds or add to those funds to kind of increase the effectiveness of those programs. I think that it's going to be really significant in 2023, but at this point, I think for the most part, the commission has just been trying to kind of gather information, but I think there's definitely more to come.
Anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think Kate covered it well. The commission's recently asked for next steps. So we filed a letter yesterday outlining some next steps for the commission, which is some reporting requirements for our investor-owned utilities to report back to the commission. To build on the issue of customer affordability, certainly as ORS does its job in the context of reviewing energy efficiency program changes, program costs, and then basic rate cases, we will be looking for what Kate mentioned, which is the leveraging of federal funding and the promotion of federal funding to customers. There's really no reason for customers to pay taxes and receive benefits that go unclaimed, especially under the IRA, and pay more for energy costs to have the utility provide the same program. There is a perfect match there for the utility to work with the customer to make sure that we're getting more for our money rather than paying twice for a benefit that the customer should have. So that's what we'll be looking forward to on our end. And of course, as ORS, we try to be good partners of anyone trying to receive federal funding, certainly through our energy office. If there's obstacles that crop up that get in the way of an investor-owned utility being able to claim or compete for some of those dollars, we want to help them to achieve success in those areas.
Thank you for that. That's great to hear. We do have one question from our audience, which I will read as submitted, and I'll allow you to kind of respond from your various perspectives. The question is, why did the South Carolina Public Service Commission reject the proposed rooftop solar program in spite of agreement between Duke and environmental organizations? I'll open that to whomever would care to offer a perspective, knowing that neither of you are.
Well, I'll be glad to speak on that. I think the commission's order speaks for itself. It was a litigated proceeding before the commission. The commission is the ultimate decision maker. It made its decision. The decision is outlined clearly in the order issued by the commission. Of course, Kate and her clients, Duke Energy and ORS, had differing perspectives on the benefits of those programs and how those benefits should be measured and the classification of those programs. And those are clearly outlined in the order.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know that I have much more to add, although I will say the commission's order rejected the program based on a finding that the program wasn't cost effective. And so that was the basis for their decision. It was a fairly narrow decision in what was a pretty highly contested proceeding. But yeah, that was the basis for the decision.
Thank you. We hope that answered the questioner's question. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'll give it another moment, but move on into our closing remarks. We'd love to hear from you, and you can let us know your thoughts on today's webinar via the link Lily has just dropped in the chat. And before we go, I wanted to share some upcoming events SEIA is planning for 2023. In February, we'll be hosting a regional convening at AESP's annual conference in New Orleans. Join us for a panel discussion on how the region is preparing for federal funding, including spotlights to uplift the successes and leadership in the region from policy to practice. Following that discussion, we're co-hosting a sky-high networking reception with light bites, signature cocktails, and sweeping views of the French Quarter and Mississippi River. And in June, we're holding an inaugural members-only meeting in Huntsville, Alabama. Please join me in thanking our panelists, as well as the SIA team, Claudette and Lily, as well as Sarah and others for their work on today's webinar. I'll turn it over to Lily.
Thank you for joining us today. As we mentioned at the top of recording of today's presentation, resources mentioned in the presentation and the slide deck will be emailed to all of the registrants. Please take a few minutes to share your feedback about today's presentation and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you all. And then there's a QR on the next screen for everybody. Give you all a minute. Okay.
Thank you all and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.